Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Betto, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. So here we are at the start of 2026, and what better way to ring in the new year than by talking about media and politics in the late 1800s and early 1900s? What does that have to do with today? Well, there's a sort of obvious answer that many of the phenomenon that we see today in terms of media saturation, media fragmentation, the rise of celebrities as politicians, not so new, also happened back then. But I think what the interesting part is that we can really trace the origins of those dynamics to that exact time period, the so-called Age of Empire, between 1890 and the start of the First World War. So my guest to discuss this is Dr. Betto van Waarden. He is an assistant professor in history at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and he has recently published a book with Cambridge University Press entitled Politicians and Mass Media in the Age of Empire. So in this episode, we are going to talk about how the technological transformations in that time period created, for the first time, public opinion, and politicians didn't know what to do with public opinion. So there's a very interesting interaction between politicians and journalists, where journalists needed to adapt also to these media transformations by filling their pages with stories and characters. And the politicians that could supply that persona became what Dr. van Waarden calls the publicity politician. These are people like Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany or Teddy Roosevelt in the US. And so what Dr. van Waarden does in the book is go into various archives across Europe and look at the media representations of these politics, but also how they cross national borders, which brings us to the idea of a transnational media system that emerged through these dynamics. And so the reason I wanted to start the year with this episode is not only because it's fascinating and the examples are just amazing, but because in the next episode, I'll talk with a journalist who has been very successful using TikTok and podcasts and Substack while also having worked for mainstream news organizations. And I think that this episode, in addition to the arguments that it's making about the emergence of the transnational media system and the rise of the publicity politician, it also tells us a lot about media then and now. And so I think that starting the year with more of a cohesive theoretical frame helps interpret some of the episodes that will be coming down later this year, talking about more current events, because it's so important to have that contextualization, that the fragmentation, the transnationalization, the change in the media and the media's fundamental role in politics is something that we can trace to the Age of Empire, and its reverberations last to the present. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my guest, Dr. Betto van Waarden. Again, he's an assistant professor in history at Maastricht University. Dr. van Waarden, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So your book examines a unique confluence of media and politics around the turn of the 19th century, which eventually gives rise to a form of publicity politician that we still see today. So I'd like to start there with the media landscape at the time. Newspapers existed long before the 1800s, so what technologies really accelerated the way that news was produced and consumed?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think what's really key here is that we see this sort of industrialization of media technology sort of towards the end of the 19th century. So it's really a matter of like increase in speed and in scale. So when you think of speed, right, like in 1800, a press could print about 250 copies of a newspaper per hour. By 1900, that's 200,000 copies. Also images, they already had technology to print images throughout the 19th century in different degrees. But what's really key sort of in the 1890s, 1900s is that this technology becomes fast enough to really print it for the daily press, right? So for daily newspapers, you can incorporate images. It's not like a sort of specific thing, like once in a while you print an image. And also on the sort of both on the news gathering and the news distribution side, I would say. So on the gathering side, right, this is really where sort of telegraphy, telephony is key, gathering news from around the world, really. And just give you a sense of that, right? When you think of news traveling from Australia to London at the time, in 1850, this still took about 3 months by ship. Then you got steamships, which kind of shortened the news gathering to 45 days in the 1860s. But by 1900, it takes 6 hours, right? So there's a key difference. But also on the distribution side, right? News also needs to be brought to the people. And this was mainly done through railways, right? So by 1900, you have 200,000 miles of railway track covering the US, creating a sort of media landscape. And also in Britain is really key to understanding that you get sort of the formation of a public sphere, like a national dialogue, because it's for the first time possible that London papers are actually read across all of the UK. There are trains delivering the paper from London to Manchester, so these people can read the same paper. Yeah, that sounds a little bit abstract, but just to visualize this again, right? When Napoleon died in 1821, this took months. This news of his death took months to reach the rest of the world. But when Bismarck died in 1898, the rest of the world knew by the next day. Okay, so this is a really key difference. Just also briefly on the scale, because I do think it's important to kind of get a sense of this, what we're talking about here. So over the course of the 19th century, there was 100-fold increase in the number of newspapers globally. And also in a country like France, the top 4 publications just before the First World War, they had a circulation of over 4 million journals, right? It's unheard of today in a certain way. Also Germany, right? Very fast growing news landscape. They had more than 4,000 different newspapers by the start of the First World War, and had a total annual sale of newspapers and magazines over 6 billion, right? This is an enormous media landscape. But I think that really the key is to understanding, and also sort of getting into the politics in a moment, to understanding that this is sort of a perfect storm around 1900. So you have the technologies, but this really kind of interconnects with all these socioeconomic factors, right? Literacy rates are going up. Public schooling laws have been instituted across different countries so people can actually read newspapers. This is very important. Also, purchasing power went up. People got higher wages so they could buy newspapers. Also, sort of labor regulations meant that people had more leisure time, so they had the time to actually read a newspaper. And of course, a lot of people are moving into the cities, right? There's sort of massive urbanization taking place at the time. Fastest growing city was in the world at the time was Berlin, right? Which kind of grew from 400,000 to 2 million or 3.5 million if you sort of count the suburbs. So really imagine you're moving, from a sort of 19th century village into this big Berlin metropolis, and everything's happening. And the way this is narrated, right? This urban life is through the newspapers, right? So people really, this is how you participated in the sort of new city life. And I think the last thing to add here is that it mattered because people got voting rights, right? So there's a key political development at the time, that extension of franchise. So people have the right to vote. So it matters to be informed. Like you want to read about politics when you have actually something to say about it. And this, of course, also puts the pressure on the politicians, as I'm sure we'll explore in the next questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to fathom the scale of this transformation. I mean, like 3 months by steamship to communicate news versus 6 hours by telegraphy. I mean, and it sounds like a pretty good time to be alive, the way you describe this this turn of the century. And all this is taking place during the Age of Empire, which was largely a time of peace, but it had these tensions brewing like within and across world powers. So could you give us a sense of what the political inner workings of these empires were like, and how the media transformations that you just outlined shifted the power dynamics fundamentally between politicians and the media?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important here to realize that this is a very specific moment in sort of imperial history, right? So there have been colonies for a couple centuries, which were largely based on trade, and they were kind of quite international, where trading companies were usually mixes of people from different nationalities. But the period between 1880 and the First World War, right? This is often called high imperialism, new imperialism. This is also the moment when you see this, what's sort of notoriously called the scramble for Africa, right? Sort of European powers all trying to kind of carve up Africa in a sense, even often when it was not sort of profitable from the sort of traditional colonial perspective. So it should very much be seen in like the context of like really extreme sort of rising nationalism, this sort of nationalist rivalry. So this high imperialism is very much about prestige. These are prestige projects in a sense, this imperialism. And how do you get prestige? Well, through attention, right? Like if nobody knows that, you're this new German world empire and you own all these colonies in Africa, but if nobody knows about that, then it's not going to be very prestigious. So you need attention. And how do you get attention? Through media. Like you need media to talk about your empire across the world so that other people are kind of impressed by this, right? So this is key, I think, to understand first. And the other thing is like to think of imperialism also as not just expansion in a territorial sense, but also as an expansion within politics itself, right? It's sort of expanding the political sphere. So politics is no longer about just sort of domestic affairs in Belgium or the Netherlands or Britain or so. It's about running a global empire, so to speak, right? So this also creates within the political scene completely new spaces and new roles. And this is where it gets interesting for some of these politicians of that time, because you had people like Bernhard von Bülow, the German imperial chancellor from 1900 to 1909, Joseph Chamberlain, he was the British colonial secretary from 1895 to 1903. These are two key figures of this moment who really understood the media, and they were outsiders. Bülow came from sort of lower ranking nobility. Chamberlain was a screw manufacturer, and this sort of imperialist space in politics really opened up an opportunity for them to kind of come in there. And this is where I think it's kind of interesting to also refer back to this very sort of infamous speech given by Bülow in the Reichstag in the German imperial parliament, where he said that Germany now also deserves a Platz an der Sonne, so like a place in the sun, right? This sort of claiming its space among the world empires in 1897. And interestingly, he was not so much, or not just claiming a space for Germany in the sun, but very much for himself, right? For Bülow, the politician, as an outsider again, right? And the same goes for Chamberlain. He was a very influential politician in the 1890s, but it's quite interesting that he didn't choose to become a minister of like the Home Office or the Exchequer, right? These were traditional prestigious ministries, but he chose to head the Colonial Office because it had the most potential in a way for sort of, global development, global visibility, right? Global attention. And here you also see when it's about the inner workings of politics, right? Which you were referring to in your question. You also see kind of a shift from sort of legislature to executive. So you see these commentaries in the newspapers at the time that, oh, we have this fast global telegraphy network. We're communicating with the empires, right? Like we need fast decisions. So you have the British Telegraph at some point writing like, there's no more time for this sort of democratic deliberation, right? We don't have time for cabinet meetings, sitting around, drafting telegraphic messages. We need these sort of CEO style figures, like a figure like Chamberlain, who can kind of react immediately through the modern communication means, right? And sort of run an empire that way. And maybe one last thought to add there, because I think this is interesting for listeners to reflect on or to think about, is that, again, we usually think of imperialism or imperial expansion as a sort of territorial expansion, right? It's a geographical thing, right? These sort of images of these sort of white European settlers taking ships and planting flags, a bit this type of imagery, right? I mean, I'm sort of exaggerating here a bit, right? But it's interesting to understand that it's not just imperial expansion of the geographical sphere, but also of the public sphere, right? And here you have the same thing, that there's always this myth, it's this terra nullius myth that, these colonized territories, they were empty before European settlers came there, which was of course not true. People lived there, right? And their land was invaded. And the same goes for the public sphere. You had many public spheres. You had many conversations taking place in public in different ways. So it's not like mass media created this public sphere. It's more that they kind of colonized it, right? So you got these key top political figures who figured out how to do mass media in a sort of strategic way. And they kind of monopolized the public sphere at the detriment of many people who were already having conversations in that public sphere, right? So there's a sort of more and more media attention going to a few very powerful players, just like you see in imperialism itself.
Interesting. And I want to get to the politicians, but I also want to focus on kind of exactly what you were hinting at, the idea of the public sphere, and in particular, the idea of public opinion, which is a concept that really just emerged in this period. I mean, the book outlines how politicians had a kind of a rough time in the beginning figuring out how to deal with the public's opinion, which was largely mediated by the press. So could you outline that dynamic for us? How did politicians try to deal with this like new and emerging public opinion and eventually work to leverage it to their advantage?
Yeah, again, good question, which is of course relevant still today in the sense that we still don't really know what public opinion is, or if it exists, how we can accurately measure it, right? This is still, despite modern polling, etc. But the thing with public opinion is really sort of the power of legitimacy that comes with it, that the idea that there's sort of the opinion of the public. And this really emerges indeed in this period that we're talking about, sort of between 1880 and the First World War, where you have this, yeah, kind of accelerating democratization, you can say. And so suddenly everyone, like I already said, right, you had the extension of voting rights. So politicians needed to also take into account the people, because now the people had the right to vote and to vote them out of politics or to vote them into politics, right? Like we see with Chamberlain as an outsider. So what you see in this period, that kind of everyone starts claiming to be the voice of public opinion, right? The newspapers, but also the politicians. And the politicians also become obsessed with trying to discern what the public opinion is, right? Like there are no opinion polls yet, or at least not sort of the variety we know today. So they're obsessively reading newspapers from around the world, right? Like they're getting, even Leopold II in Belgium, he was reading newspapers from India, right? Like, I mean, he wanted to be up to date on what was happening in the world. So all these figures that Bülow that I just mentioned, Chamberlain, but also Kaiser Wilhelm II, also Cecil Rhodes, who I also studied, they all had, every day, all sort of newspapers from around the world were sort of laid out for them by their assistants, or they would get these sort of press cutting agencies would prepare lots of cuttings on topics that they were interested in so that they could kind of stay abreast on what was happening in the world. So already there you see the sense of like an information overload. There's so much mass press out there in the world. How can we digest this all? And you get these agencies specialized in making these cuttings also for the politicians. And of course, it then becomes very controversial, like, or you get sort of a politics of what I call the politics of press consumption. So it becomes very important which newspapers political leaders read, because based on that, they will make their decisions, right? So you see that there's a lot of strategizing going on around this. So Bülow, who's the imperial chancellor underneath the Kaiser Wilhelm II, so the Kaiser is his boss in a sense, he's trying to kind of influence which newspapers the emperor will read, right? Also because the emperor is known to have, to sort of have the opinion of the last article he's read or the last person he has met, right? Something we see also today with Trump, where it's a bit this thing that, he will have whatever opinion of the advisor he has last spoken to, or which foreign leader he has last spoken to. So you see also in the public sphere that in the newspapers themselves, there's a big discussion on like, which newspapers is our emperor reading, because this matters, right? Like that has an impact on our country. Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here as well is that it's not just the elected politicians who are obsessed with public opinion. It's also, or more so, interestingly, some of the traditional aristocrats. So, of course, in Britain, you have the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and the House of Commons, they're voted in. I mean, voting in different moments was still restricted, right? But you get more and more people voting for the House of Commons. So they, in a sense, have at least some gauge of what the public wants, because the public is voting them in or out of office, right? That gives you a sort of basic sense. But the peers, right? The peers in the House of Lords, there's no voting mechanism to tell them like whether the public approves or disapproves of what they're doing. So they were actually studying the newspapers even more fervently than the people in the House of Commons. And the same goes for monarchs, right? You think, okay, monarchs are kind of above all this. They're above elections. They're just monarchs for life. And in a way they were, right? Like the legitimacy used to be based on sort of a God-given right to rule. But this is kind of becoming outdated in the 19th century, right? This is modernization. So they need to also have public opinion on board. So they kind of reinvent themselves as a direct expression of public opinion, as an even more direct expression of public opinion than elected politicians. So in that sense, I think public opinion and kind of weaponizing it really also paves this new path to power for political outsiders, right? I already mentioned Chamberlain. So he's kind of bypassing the traditional aristocratic politicians in Britain. And the same goes for Bülow, right? Who actually managed by sort of creating favorable press coverage about himself, both in Italy and in Germany. He kind of, maneuvered himself into political positions, right? So Bülow was not elected in the German political system. The foreign minister and the chancellor were not elected. They were appointed by the emperor. But he basically showed the emperor, look, there's all this press coverage of me being this great diplomat. Maybe you want to consider me for for these positions. And that kind of, in a certain way, like got him into office as a foreign minister and later as a chancellor. And later again, during World War I, he became again the ambassador in Rome, based on this favorable press coverage of himself that he created. Just to add one last detail here, which we can pick up again later, is so on the one hand, there's a democratization taking place, but there's also, what I call like a de-democratization, right? Sort of democratic backsliding here, because on the one hand, these politicians are connecting directly with the public, right? It's a sort of form of direct monarchy, like the monarch has a direct connection with his people through the media. So it's democratic. On the other hand, it is also kind of foreshadowing fascism and populism, right? This idea that the supreme leader represents the true people directly, bypassing institutions like parliaments and bureaucracies.
Right. We are heading into two major world wars. Let's not forget. But that's interesting what you say about like the monarchs and the unelected officials being interested. I mean, would it be fair to say that this was kind of like the first time someone is presented with a mirror to kind of see how they're reflected? And I could see how that would be fascinating for someone who never really has that type of validation or criticism formed and presented to them.
Yeah, I think so. It's a feedback mechanism, right? So, and in a certain way, it becomes a daily feedback mechanism, or almost almost hourly. I mean, nowadays we complain about, news is incessant and never ending online, right? There's no more even like a daily rhythm. But also at the time, you had certain newspapers publishing multiple editions per day, kind of advertising. You'll never be more than a couple hours behind the financial news and political news. So they get this mirror that's constantly reflecting their own behavior to them and the public's opinion of them. And of course, the question is, does it affect them? Does it change their behavior? And this is, of course, difficult to know. But it certainly seems to have had an impact in that the Kaiser was known to make also very eccentric remarks. He kind of went off the record a lot, kind of spiraling out of control a lot. And has led to a series of political scandals, right, where he kind of made these very sort of offensive remarks. One sort of notable example is the Daily Telegraph affair, where he basically had this interview while he was in Britain visiting, and later his comments were published sort of in the form of an interview, and he managed to offend a whole series of countries at the same time. Right, so he had said that the British should ignore, I think, the French and German ideas for how they should wage their South African war. That he had actually provided a plan for this war to Queen Victoria, right, who was related to him, which upset his German readers because the Germans were feeling affinities with German descendant Boers in South Africa that were fighting against the British. He also said in the interview, the British shouldn't be worried about the German fleet, this new navy that the Germans were building, because it was mostly meant for the Far East, right, which upset the Japanese. So he basically managed to upset everybody. And you see that the speed of news, it prevented actually his aides, his political advisors, to still kind of mitigate this crisis. So they were still in Berlin trying to debate how to kind of deal with this fallout and how to kind of censor the distribution of this interview. And then it had already, kind of sparked internationally, right? So newspapers were copying it internationally from each other, from other countries. So it was really like a sort of wildfire going around. And this really caused big repercussions for him. Really also public backlash in Germany for the first time, also in the German parliament, really calling the emperor to account. I mean, they couldn't directly call the emperor to account, so they called Bülow, his chancellor, to account, and basically told Bülow, you need to kind of take the emperor on a leash here. Like, you cannot go out and say these things in international relations, right? He needs to be more careful. And it seems like this really hurt the emperor's power and influence, which is kind of interesting in itself, because he had actually created a lot of that power through the mass media that we're talking about, right? Because the German Empire was created in 1871. And the position of German emperor was a new political position. There was no clear guidelines for what that was, in a sense, or how much power this figure should have. And through mass media, Wilhelm II kind of took on more power and started making policy through sort of mediated speeches in military, in education and social policy. But because of these scandals, because of this mirror that you're talking about, he realized, okay, I need to take a step back.
Which gets exactly at this idea of international relations, which I find so fascinating. Like, what is the German emperor doing talking to the British press in the first place? Because there's kind of this interesting tension where politicians are having to deal with this newly formed public opinion, this kind of new technologies that are making it even possible. But then they're really going out and trying to sway the public opinion of people in other countries who can't really, vote for them. So you mentioned earlier this idea of like empires as a prestige project, but what kind of explains why these politicians were actively trying to sway the public opinion in other countries?
Yeah, good question again, right? And also a relevant question still today because government spends so much on international propaganda that's often a bit under the radar. But I think there are no clear rational answers for it. It's a bit of a mix. But I think it also comes again back to this prestige, which you already bring up yourself, right? I think there's very much a competition taking place for international attention. So yeah, it's this time of these growing empires. So they're kind of staking claims vis-a-vis each other, being assertive, but also trying to kind of reassure the publics abroad that, they're not being threatening either, right? Like they're not really trying to wage war or anything, right? So, and then it also gets into the kind of swaying publics abroad to kind of be your friend or not, right? Like this is also the period of these alliances, right? Bismarck was known for these alliances, like all these pre-World War I alliances between countries. And based on what do you make an alliance, whether you trust that other country, right? So there's this constant back and forth also between Britain and Germany at the time of should we form a political alliance? And then what's being said in the media and sort of magnified in the domestic and foreign press, this has, of course, a big impact on whether politicians feel like they can or they should have an alliance with each other. And there you also see that some of these media upheavals in the end lead Britain to kind of abandon the idea of having an alliance with Germany. But interestingly, there's also, it also had sort of strategic advantages, right? So it's not so bad also if people abroad were angry, right? And we still see this today. It's what in the book I call strategic press controversy. So basically, like you're strengthening your own visibility and popularity at home by pointing out that everybody abroad is angry at you, right? So at some point in 1902, you have this dispute also between Bülow and Chamberlain, right? Where Chamberlain had made some speech that, in the South African War, the British didn't do anything that the Germans hadn't done in their war of 1870-71, right? The sort of the war between Prussia and Germany that kind of created the German Empire. And Chamberlain had meant this as like, don't worry, we're not doing anything bad or nothing nobody else has done, right? But because everybody else outside Britain thought like, basically what we're seeing in South Africa at the moment are war atrocities or what in modern terms we might call war crimes. So they thought this was an enormous insult to like the German army, accusing the German army of having committed also war crimes against the French 3 decades ago. So Bülow responds to this and it becomes this kind of back and forth where they make these speeches and these comments in the media that really they kind of explode in the international press, right? And they constantly lead to reactions. But they popularize both politicians at home, right? They make both of them very popular because their domestic audience thinks, our politician is under attack and is being insulted by these foreign leaders. So we're going to support we're going to sort of this rally around the flag idea. And then you also see from domestic critics of Bülow, like, okay, let's control the criticism here. Let's not be all angry at Chamberlain abroad because this is only fueling support for Bülow. So we shouldn't help him in this strategic press controversy. I think it's also interesting just to give also listeners a sense of the scale of this. So I spent some time in different archives, but one of them was the political archive of the German Foreign Office. And there you can look in these folders and very neatly kept records of how much not just the German government itself, but also how much other governments were spending on bribing and, quote unquote, subsidizing the press abroad. So the German government did this, but all governments were doing this, right? The British, the French, the Russians. the Spanish, everybody was doing this. And they kept a nice record of how much everybody was spending. Although interestingly, it didn't, and that's the key point about this period in time and where you see the shift in this kind of formation of publicity politicians, that this old method of trying to steer public opinion abroad was kind of losing effectiveness. So there's kind of a loss of control here because you have this massive commercialization of the press. So the press becomes more financially independent. So they're not as vulnerable to, or not as dependent on subsidies, or vulnerable to bribes, however you want to phrase that. And also prosecuting journalists no longer worked so well because this would then also be kind of magnified in the press. So it would only backfire, right? If you prosecute a journalist for writing a certain article, that article would only gain more publicity because you're prosecuting the journalist. So this wasn't working. Of course, you couldn't really control the reception of your messages abroad or at home even. And you really see that the speed of the international communication, it becomes just too fast to really anticipate and react, right? This is a bit what we saw with this Daily Telegraph interview that I just mentioned. Like it was just too late to still trying to do anything about it.
Definitely. And I mean, I think all this kind of points to the emergence of a key concept in the book, which is the transnational media system. And I think maybe it's helpful to introduce that concept through the book's empirical cases, which you've been hinting at, but really kicks off with this Jameson raid and the transnational media dynamics that follow. So what's kind of the potted history of what happened with this Jameson raid? Who are the main characters and how does it show this media system as becoming transnational?
Yeah, I think indeed the Jameson raid is really a nice example here because it brings together so many of these different dynamics taking place. So just as a sort of very brief summary of it, right? The Jameson raid is also very well known sort of in history writing. It's often been remarked upon, but then more about like the question of like who did what, when, where, and who was guilty kind of, right? But there's not been so much attention for what does this actually show us about like the emergence and the functioning of sort of transnational media system. So it started, or just give you a very brief background, the British colonizers in Southern Africa in the past had kind of pushed the previous Dutch colonizers of Southern Africa to the north. They're called the Boers, right? They're sort of descendants of the Dutch and also of the Germans and French. And then in the 1880s, there's gold discovered in the Orange Free State and South African Republic, these Boer republics. So more and more British colonizers also move into these Boer territories looking for gold. And the Dutch there, or these Boers there, they're afraid that if they give these Brits also political rights, then they will become a minority in their own colony. So this is kind of the background. And it actually then kicks off with a media event, namely that there's this forged letter, this women and children's letter that's forged, is published in the Times, right? The Times was the most influential international newspaper at the time, published in London, read internationally. And there's this letter that, the sort of women and children of British descendants in these Boer republics are crying out for help, in a sense. So Jameson goes in with this kind of British expedition to kind of free the people in Johannesburg, or to rescue them, in a sense. And this raid is countered by the South African Republic's president, Paul Kruger. This raid is basically put down in no time, and these guys are captured. So it all kind of comes to nothing, but it becomes a huge media storm. So the event itself was that's what's interesting as well. The event was fairly minor in a certain way, you could say, but it becomes an enormous media storm. And also the German emperor then publishes a telegram that he sends to President Kruger, so the South African president, congratulating him on having resisted this incursion without appealing to the help of foreign powers, right? i.e. Germany, in a sense, which completely upsets the British because they say, they think, this Germany would have helped the Boers, etc. Interestingly, there's another sort of message in the media that goes viral, to use our current terms, defending the British against the Germans here, which allegedly had been written by Leopold II, by the king, which turned out not to be true, but it was published by his friend. So he was also involved. And basically this whole thing becomes like this enormous news event around the world, with newspapers in Germany siding with newspapers in Britain, in South Africa, in Japan, in America are writing about this, and vice versa. So that's one thing, right? It's transnational in that newspapers are all quoting each other internationally, but also that it's transnational and that it's becoming one international story. So you see that the complexity of international relations, of of industrialization, of colonization. These are really complex processes taking place at the time, and they're all kind of interconnected, but they become narrated through a kind of simple story focusing on a few key personalities, right? So you had Cecil Rhodes, the South African mining magnate who was involved. He was the prime minister of the Cape Colony in Southern Africa. Joseph Chamberlain at the time was the colonial secretary. Then you had, of course, Kruger that we just mentioned, and the Kaiser who had sent him this telegram. So they are kind of these key protagonists in this unfolding story, and everybody internationally is reading about the interactions and the dynamics between these personalities. And the interesting thing there is also coming back to the public opinion point we discussed earlier, that they all publish all their correspondence. So all these politicians, they're sending telegraphs to each other and letters. But rather than keeping them private, as would have been the case in sort of former diplomacy, right? Diplomacy was always kind of this elite affair that took place behind closed doors. The public wouldn't be aware of this usually, but now they're all putting it out in the open, right? They're publishing their telegraphs to each other. And this continues, and that's really interesting. I mean, Chamberlain even publishes this, like, I think 48 points reasoning of the British government of why it was reacting in certain ways or not, and all putting this on 4 pages of newspapers spread out, like laying the government's reasoning out there for the public. I mean, unimaginable like a few decades earlier. And yeah, it's interesting that the follow-up to a lot of this, right? Because you have the main event in a sense, and okay, that's a media storm, but fair enough. But the follow-up shows us actually some more interesting dynamics as well. So Chamberlain and Kruger keep publishing their exchanges to the degree, and Kruger would actually ask Chamberlain in the messages, hey, can you please publish this telegram that you're receiving from me? And also the other way around, that at some point there's a scandal because Chamberlain has published a message to Kruger to South Africa. He has published it before it has even reached Kruger. So Kruger hears about it through the news before it has actually reached him, right? And all this publicity then also constrains these actors. So because it's such a scandal, there's all these demands to have a hearing on this. And Chamberlain actually wants to cancel this hearing. He doesn't want the truth to surface in all of this, but there's been too much publicity for him to kind of suppress all this at this point. And even then the key figures are coming in for the hearing. So Rhodes and Jameson are both taking ships from Southern Africa to London to be heard. And then this becomes a media frenzy in itself. So like, is this kind of counting down towards the arrival of these figures, right? Because this takes 3 weeks to reach London at the time. So it's like every day there's an update in the newspaper. Rhodes reached Madeira, the island, they're putting it to port. And then finally they reach Plymouth, and there's these crowds waiting, and these crowds of journalists waiting for 10 hours in the cold, waiting to get a snapshot of Rhodes or Jameson. It's kind of this paparazzi style flogging to these politicians, even though they didn't use that word yet, of course. And in a sort of final follow-up, it's a few years later, there's this one of this key journalist, W.T. Stead, he's called. He's kind of this notorious investigative journalist at the time. He wants to publish what's called the history of a mystery. So basically the history of the Jameson raid, looking back. And Rhodes doesn't want this, right? So he's also in contact with Rhodes a lot. So this is another example of politicians or political figures and journalists interacting. They knew each other quite well. And Rhodes doesn't want all of this history to come out. So he wants to censor parts. And okay, but Stead still goes ahead and publishes this in Britain, but he censors the parts that Rhodes didn't want to be in there. But accidentally, the journalist in South Africa who was working on the story together with Stead accidentally publishes the full story, including the censored parts. And within this transnational media system, this story immediately reaches Britain and the rest of the world, right? You can no longer hide stories in different parts of the world. So I think this is interesting to note. Yeah, and also in this story, because of all this media frenzy, these protagonists are basically redeemed. So it's a bit what I said earlier with this strategic press criticism. They got criticized so much by foreign publics and foreign newspapers that they become heroes and they become redeemed at home, even though they made massive political mistakes, basically. And yeah, good to mention maybe in the Jameson raid too, is that some of the people mediating in the conflict behind doors were actually the journalists. So Valentin Chirol, he was a Times journalist. He was kind of acting as a liaison also between the German and the British governments. So you see this very intertwined worlds of journalism and politics. And you see overall that, yeah, it becomes impossible to kind of separate public spheres, like the British, German, South African public spheres. They're all interconnected at this point.
Right. I could totally see myself being hooked on that story as the positions of governments are being published. The ship is on its way to London. Yeah, I get it. But as part of your field work for the book, you analyzed newspaper coverage of these key politicians from 32 archives across Britain, Germany, and Belgian newspapers. And your analysis, and really, I think one of the key points of the book, is to argue for the emergence of what you call the publicity politician, which we've also been kind of talking about already. But each chapter in the book discusses a key characteristic of these politicians, but generally, like, what separated a publicity politician from other ones who are maybe less well known today?
Yeah, I think the answer is partly already in your own question, so that they are known. And the Kaiser is a very nice example because he's still known today. Most people today have some vague sense of like this German emperor, right, with his sort of his spiky helmet and these types of things. So that's key, right? The publicity politician was simply a visible politician. But I think there are a couple of characteristics that really set them apart from their contemporaries and also some of their successors. So one, as we discussed in one of the earlier questions, right, like they're kind of hypersensitive to public opinion. They're really trying to kind of follow almost daily the different directions of public opinion, right? This is a bit the mirror point you were making yourself. So they're constantly looking in the mirror, so to speak, even though they're claiming to have very thick skin. So Bülow, at some point, I think he makes a speech in the Reichstag saying like, yeah, you know, a modern politician needs to have the thick skin of a hippopotamus, right? And it's a sort of bold statement. And he's also accusing some of the other politicians of being kind of old-fashioned and not having and being soft, right? Like they cannot take the heat from the media. He also distinguishes politicians and diplomats in that way, right? He says diplomats are softies in that they don't have the thick skin of politicians like he does. But behind scenes, I mean, he has very thin skin. Right? He's very sensitive himself. But so they're very sensitive to public opinion. But because they're so sensitive, they're also trying to steer public opinion very much, right? To make sure that the public opinion is basically their own opinion. So then they will be aligned with the public opinion. So they try to manage the media, the writing in the media themselves. They're editing newspapers. And this goes also back in the 19th century, right? There are earlier figures doing this. Also figures you wouldn't necessarily think of, right? When you think of like Abraham Lincoln in the US. He wrote a lot in the press, basically anonymously, promoting himself and criticizing his political enemies. But so you have these publicity politicians writing, editing, strategizing in a way how to get their viewpoints into the media. Leopold II is also an interesting case here, really spending a lot of money bribing newspapers in Belgium, so Journal de Bruxelles, but also a lot of other newspapers. Also foreign newspapers in Belgium. So he bribes the correspondent of the Times, which later becomes a scandal, and then the journalist is fired because the Times really prides itself on being kind of independent, which is not entirely true because it's also kind of influenced by the British government. But the British always pretend that, you know, their quality press is more independent than in other countries, which is it's not entirely true. It has some truth in it. But Leopold is bribing these journalists. He's also spending a lot of money on newspapers abroad, right? It's a bit the point I made with the Berlin archive, where you had these overviews of how much countries were spending on bribing journalists in other countries. So Leopold II, he's not so visible as a publicity politician, but he's spending a lot of time strategizing and funding behind the scenes. So he's really trying to influence the press in Britain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the US, right? In Germany alone, he has these different press agents in different cities, in Cologne, in Munich, in Frankfurt, with the agent he has in Cologne at some point reports back, I think in 1907, that he managed to submit between 5,000 and 6,000 articles and pamphlets into sort of the public sphere in Germany, right? And that's one agent. I mean, it's also not entirely surprising that around 1904, public opinion in Germany becomes a little bit more in favor of his Congo Free State, right? Where all these atrocities are taking place. And in fact, to maybe round up the Leopold point in this managing the media, he also subsidizes newspapers in the US and also pays for lobbyists to lobby the US politicians. And this actually leads to the US being the first country to recognize Leopold's authority in the Congo and to really kind of give him the mandate, to give him the authority to kind of govern the Congo Free State, right? This becomes, I mean, is a crazy story in itself, right? That colonialism was already kind of a whole crazy phenomenon in many ways with many injustices and many complexities and problems. But amidst all that, you have a Belgian king who sort of manages to kind of carve out an enormous private colony. And he largely has done this by influencing public opinion, notably in the US, on the other side of the world. And then the US recognizes this colony. And then because the US recognized the colony, European countries follow in a sense. Anyway, so that's the sort of managing the media. And the interesting thing, what sets these publicity politicians apart as well, is that they really have a journalistic instinct themselves. So they really start incorporating the media in all of their thinking, in all of their political decisions. They think about, how should I play this in the media? How should we prepare the media for this? How do we take into account public opinion? How do we influence public opinion? But the problem is they also let a genie out of the bottle and they can no longer get it back in. So I mentioned the speed and scale of the new mass press. Yeah, they cannot control this. So it really sort of bites them in the tail in the end. What also sets them apart is that they start behaving like these celebrity figures, which we can talk about in a bit later, maybe. And that they become these sort of, what I call communicative anchors. So the complexities of international relations. So this example of the Jameson raid, all this industrial imperial competition taking place. This is very difficult to understand for a mass audience, for mass readers, for mass readership. So you simplify it. You reduce the complexity by making it a story about a few key figures like Leopold, the Kaiser, and Chamberlain kind of interacting. And because you keep focusing on them, there's a sort of Matthew effect, right? So if a certain politician already gets certain attention, he or she will automatically get more attention because it's more attractive for a journalist to keep writing a continued story about the Kaiser, the crazy Kaiser that we all know, the sort of next sequel arises, the next story, rather than writing a story about another unknown political figure. Yeah, you said how are they distinguished in a sense, right, from some of the other politicians around them? And here it's interesting to also point out that this media politics, it's not like a linear progression. So you had Bismarck, right, Otto von Bismarck, this infamous first chancellor of the German Empire. He established a secret press office, and Bülow actually worked in that secret press office. So he learned the ropes from Bismarck, and he kind of, his critics even say that Bülow started running the secret press office like a full-on German ministry, even though it was kept in the dark. But you have Bismarck doing this media management stuff, but then after him, you have two chancellors, Caprivi and Hohenlohe. They're not really up to speed on this modern media in a certain way, right? So it kind of drops again. And then Bülow picks it up. And then Bethmann Hollweg, the next chancellor, also he doesn't have the same instinct for the press. And he also suffers as a result. And you see the same thing taking place in the US, that Theodore Roosevelt was very good at playing the media, really kind of innovated a lot of sort of media politics in the US. But then afterwards, William Taft comes into office, into the White House. And it's impossible for him to live up to that bar that has now been set by Roosevelt. So he becomes quite unpopular because he doesn't manage to manage the media in the same way anymore.
And fun fact, is the only president to be stuck in a bathtub, I believe, twice, Taft. But yeah, so there's like all this interesting dynamics between the politicians and the media that kind of fit into the commercial logics of the media at the time, which is something that we tend to think about in political communication as starting in like the 60s with the broadcast era. But you show that it goes way farther back than that. And a key part of that is politicians' visual appeal and, as you mentioned, their celebrity. So could you outline why this visual communication was particularly useful for journalists at the time and how it kind of also supported the politicians' own publicity?
Yeah, it's really the power of images. Like you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, right? Like the press in itself was not a new thing that had been around for a few centuries. Like you could read the printed word, although, as I pointed out, a lot of people, of course, couldn't read in the past. So literacy rates also made a big difference in 1900. But an image, everybody can see an image, right? Also, children, anybody, and sort of, it doesn't speak for itself. It can it can tell you a lot of different stories, and you can have many different interpretations of an image. But they're very powerful, right? And there's really like a visual revolution taking place in this time. The sociologist John Thompson has also called this period the transformation of visibility. So politics used to be this kind of elite inner affair, and now it becomes really this public affair that the greater public can also observe politics. And that's not only in sort of photographs and newspapers, just to make that clear. So film also comes around. So 1890s, you have early cinematography, and this kind of in the early 1900s, this kind of takes off, right? So you have 20 registered cinemas in Berlin in the 1890s. And yeah, by the start of the First World War, you have about 350 of them and about 600 cinemas in London, I think at the time, globally around 60,000 cinemas, right, by the start of World War I. So imagery really becomes a thing in the press, in the media. The Kaiser was also, yeah, in a sense, he's been called Germany's first film star, right? So Wilhelm II is also called not just Wilhelm, but Filmhelm. And yeah, actually over 300 clips have been recorded of him and have been shown at cinemas across Germany and also abroad, right? Often after you watched your regular screening in the cinema, there would be these kind of short reels. So then suddenly the German emperor would pop up. So he was very well known because of that, because of his image. And so why is this so attractive to the media themselves, right? Of course it sells, right? This is a bit where you're saying yourself with this commercial need. The media need to sell stuff that's attractive to people. Images are striking. They grab the attention. They make people buy newspapers or watch films. And that's what also distinguishes some of these politicians, right? That you need to have certain characteristics to be successful in a visual political landscape. So it's a different political landscape than the one you had before, where it didn't matter what you looked like or how you comported yourself in public. Now you need to be recognizable. And this is where you see this advantage, notably of the Kaiser that we've been talking about. Right, I already said some of us may already have still an image in our minds of this kind of crazy looking Kaiser with this traditional German army helmet with this spike on top, right? If you had from the old days, like if you would try to whack someone in the head with a big sword, your sword would be deflected by this sort of pointy thing on your helmet. So he was always wearing this. He has this big W-shaped mustache, right? The Wilhelm mustache, which also youths copy, right? Like young boys in Germany, they're all copying this fashion of the spiky mustache that their Kaiser is wearing. And he has these kind of striking boots always. So he's very recognizable. Same with Chamberlain. And it seems quite deliberate. Chamberlain seemed very well aware of the importance of being a recognizable person for media, right? So he was always wearing this monocle, and he always had an orchard in his buttonholes, making him very recognizable. Roosevelt was, there was some nice quote from a journalist at the time saying something like, yeah, the sort of Roosevelt's teeth are like a godsend, right? Like they make him so distinguishable in images. And funnily enough, Leopold, who we've just been talking about, right? He actually tried to stay out of the limelight. He was a bit more this sort of backstage manipulator, if you want to put it that way. But he had this really big, square, white beard, which made him incredibly recognizable. So if you see media from the time, you always pick him out. And then Bülow always had this sort of black poodle Märchen with him, which was also often visualized. So that's on the sort of visual side, they were striking, but also in terms of what do you portray? Like if you have magazines, lifestyle magazines, also films, you also need input, right? So one is indeed what these figures look like. Two is also sort of then writing about their personalities, right? That this became a thing in 1900, like focusing more on the psychology of your political leaders and on their authenticity. And this authenticity, they would often try to prove by kind of showing their private lives. So this is really where you start seeing this sort of privatization of politics, that politicians kind of invite journalists into their home, into their lives. They show their hobbies, their horse riding, playing with their children. They do all these photographs with their families, these sort of group photos. Yeah, in front of their mansions also often. And indeed, you have these sort of reports really detailing how their houses even look like, right? So you get these sort of tours of the residences of these political leaders, which really gives you an intimate look into their lives. And of course, this created a sort of intimacy that people we talked at the beginning about. This is a time of urbanization. So a lot of people are kind of being uprooted. They're losing their traditional community. They're They're living in these big cities now in London, in Paris, in Berlin. It's this sort of big, anonymous, alienating city life, right? Where you can no longer, the traditional bonds of trust have crumbled from your village. You cannot trust people. How do you trust people? Well, you need to get to know them intimately. So by these politicians revealing their homes and their intimate lives to their readers, to their viewers, they kind of establish this kind of, yeah, parasocial relationship of trust with their audiences, with their voters. And they really also, apart from simply having nice houses to show, they also are always doing interesting stuff, these politicians. So they're always traveling, right? The Kaiser is called the Reisekaiser. So like the travel Kaiser, he's always out and about. He's always on some cruiser cruising around the world. You see these really striking images of Roosevelt riding a camel in front of the pyramids in Egypt while he's on holiday, or shooting wild game in Africa, or there's this cover image in the Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, this mass publication in Berlin, this official magazine, where you see him kind of manhandling this steam shovel, personally digging the Panama Canal, right? I mean, when you think of like a sort of assertive executive American president, right? He's sitting in his white suit in his steam shovel, personally digging the Panama Canal. I mean, this is for journalists, this is gold, right? I mean, this is what you want to show your readers. This is what you want to show in the kiosks at the train stations. People will buy this. Regardless of the politics, right? Regardless if you agree with the Panama Canal and all these things. And then maybe to round that off, like the visual thing also is very important for caricature, because yeah, for satirists to make a caricature of a politician, the politician needs to have something recognizable so that you can depict them and readers will know who you're depicting, right? So it was very easy to depict the Kaiser with his helmet and his mustache and his boots, or Chamberlain with his monocle and his orchard in the buttonhole.
Right, exactly. And that caricaturization is really important because political cartoons were one way that journalists could fill the pages of their newspapers to meet this increased demand. But you kind of mentioned a bit this transition to urbanization and modernity and kind of the identity crisis that was sort of emerging at the period. And what I thought was super interesting was your arguments around the idea of hyper-masculinity that many of these politicians shared. And like, yeah, Roosevelt with a steam shovel. I mean, masculinity at the time and the way it was depicted was just like out of control. And you can kind of explain that through a sort of crisis in masculinity that came about from modernity. And I think especially now today with people talking about the kind of new crisis of masculinity, I think there are some parallels. So I'm curious if you could kind of like unpack that dynamic for us. Like, how did these very masculine leaders kind of fit a demand at the time?
Yeah, it's they were indeed meeting a certain demand, right? So the 19th century is also very much known as the Victorian age, right? This idea that yeah, life became kind of modern and bourgeois. So you had males losing their traditional roles. You had the emancipation of women, of course. Interestingly, the mass media played a large role in that because they also included women in the public sphere a lot more. Also because the way they depicted city life, right? But also commercially, right? So women had more leisure time in the home, not necessarily true, but they were the ones consuming a lot of these magazines, right? So the media were catering specifically often with the visual magazines to women. And so a lot of the products also being sold in the advertisements were products for the home, right? They were targeted at women in the home who would want to have this in their home. So a lot of the commercialization of the press was actually targeted at women. And so women were much more included in public life for this reason. But the flip side of this was that, yeah, males felt kind of threatened. Before World War I, there was, of course, there was also a sense that, yeah, there had been a peacetime, right? So for almost a century since the Napoleonic Wars, there had been relative peace in Europe, right? I mean, with exceptions, Crimean War, Franco-Prussian War. But so this was also a period where people started romanticizing virility, right? I mean, Nietzsche is also a bit of I think, an example of this sort of romanticizing also the Greco-Roman valor and these things. Yeah, romanticizing masculine harshness. And you also see a shift in what masculinity actually means then. It used to mean more like, yeah, responsibility, like taking care of your household, providing security, like that was sort of the old patriarchal sort of masculinity model, if you will. And this becomes much more sensationalist and aggressive around 1900. So it becomes much more about machismo. And there's a sense that, yeah, boys growing up in this age, they need new role models, right? And this is where both colonialism and mass media come in, and it becomes a bit this toxic cocktail, you could say, because the media, like we just discussed with the last point, they needed striking figures, right? People who were eccentric, who looked strange, who were doing crazy things, right? So you wanted these figures with military uniforms, like the Kaiser. He was, I mean, he was well known also for changing uniforms multiple times a day, right? That he, it's a bit this joke that he came out a couple times a day in a new version of himself as sort of constant news for the journalists, because every few hours he looked different again.
Right, like a hussar, and then he'd come out as the emperor, and then he'd come out like he literally changed costumes during the day.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And he's known as yeah, he was like a hunter, and he was a traveler, and he was an emperor, and he was a military figure, and all of these things constantly changing. Yeah, and indeed, right, the media needed these striking figures, like what I mentioned, this kind of macho Roosevelt manhandling a steam shovel. This worked well from a media perspective, simply from the commercial logic of the media, right? Like journalists didn't personally care necessarily, but this is just what sold because it looked kind of eccentric. And colonialism provided a space for this, for good and bad, right? So it had this sort of adventurous allure and so forth. So all these things came together with this hyper masculinity to catapult some of these politicians into media visibility that also kind of promoted this type of masculinity, I think.
Right. And also with this idea of like modernity itself. So like you write about how the Kaiser would be pictured on a modern steamship looking up at a Zeppelin airship, which has kind of projected his values of modernity. And I thought about, we saw the same thing very recently with Barack Obama running against a very old John McCain. And his image was managed so that he always had his BlackBerry to look kind of technological and contrast that to John McCain. So, I mean, there's just so many parallels throughout the book of publicity politicians and how the strategies they use today are really not so different. So do you tend to see, when you kind of take a step back, more differences and similarities in today's politics? And, kind of what can we take from this historical record to better understand media and politics today?
Yeah, of course, very good question as well. And indeed, you see this through time, this technology point also, right, that you mentioned, that the Kaiser, but also partly Roosevelt, but especially the Kaiser, was really mingling with sort of the leading industrialists and inventors of his time, with the leading people in shipping and electrical engineering, in banking. So this was kind of the people he was hanging out with. So if you would indeed draw the parallel today, if the Kaiser were with us today, he would probably be hanging out with like sort of the tech pros of today.
Having his own crypto coin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kaiser crypto.
Yeah. I mean, there have been many parallels with between the Kaiser and Trump. And I'm not the first one to say that, but in many different ways. Yeah, I think you have both, right? You have the differences and the similarities, although I think the differences are more in a certain way, yeah, superficial, you could say. I mean, in a sense that, of course, every time you have a new type of medium, right? Like radio emerges, television emerges, internet, social media, now artificial intelligence. And of course, this always interacts with also changing historical contexts. Of course, the time of the wars is different, the post-war situation, and of course, our more current times. So I think that's also what will explain a lot of the key differences. But more interesting maybe here is also the similarities. So you see a couple of these patterns that we really are still with us. So on the one hand, this need for personalization, and with this personalization, also indeed this associating with technology and modernity, like to take readers, viewers into their private lives as politicians, but also show that they're very up to date, that they're very modern, right? That they're using cars and airplanes or that they're interested in these things in Zeppelin airships. And I think you still see that a lot today. Of course, also the sort of paradoxical flip side of that, because the more politicians behave like these kind of celebrity figures and personalize their politics, the more you get this criticism, oh, it's all fake, it's all kind of, it's a sort of personification of politics at the expense of the content, right? At the expense of real political debate. And this yearning for authentic, real politicians, right? Not the sleazy, media savvy, mediagenic figures. So authenticity becomes a key principle. And that's also what you saw at that time, right? That these publicity politicians, they spent a lot of time trying to look authentic, to trying to not seem like sort of slick celebrity figures, even though all the reporting on their supposed authenticity paradoxically made them more of a celebrity, which increased the distance between them and the quote unquote common people. But I think the most striking similarity is maybe also the fact that you need a story. So journalists, I mean, one on a practical level, right? Like journalists, they need to somehow connect. There's many facts happening in the world, in politics, in international relations. How do you turn all of those complex facts into something digestible for like a mass audience that people understand and also want to actually consume, right? That they will be interested in. So you need to give these stories and these complex issues of industrialization, modernization, imperialism, you need to give them a human face so that people will understand them and will also engage with them. And the same is still true today for political issues or social issues that we're dealing with today. So in that sense, I think when we talk about the lessons that we can draw, it's really, I think that it's not this sort of dichotomy of substance or style in politics, but you really need both. Also for social causes, right? You don't want to be drowned out by the clamor about the sort of personalities, because this is also what you saw around 1900, that these publicity politicians, like I mentioned, they kind of monopolized more and more the public sphere, right? With this Matthew effect of garnering more and more attention towards them. But this attention came at the cost of attention for other things politically, right? So this is also the time of social movements, labor movement, women's rights movement. Colonized peoples were resisting the colonizers, right? Like they were also clamoring for attention in media for their causes. But this is partly drowned out by these, kind of crazy celebrities like riding camels and manhandling steam shovels, right? So that's also a lesson for today. If you have a certain political cause, you need to personalize it in a certain way. This is also what I've been looking at in my follow-up research on how parliaments as these kind of anonymous, boring institutions, 500 men in gray suits talking all day in the 20th century. How did they stay relevant after all of this happened, right? After all these publicity politicians emerged, hogging the public sphere, hogging the attention. So you need to also use new forms of media in strategic ways to stay in the political game. And you see that also, I think, in more recent political movements, right? For a long time, the climate change movement was sort of focusing its visuals on melting ice caps, which was very distant from people. It was impersonal. People, you don't associate with an ice cap, right? When you live in your home and etc. But then eventually they focused more and more like Greta Thunberg, right? Like, okay, there's a sort of leader. It's symbolic. It's literally a face that's on the climate change movement that it can mobilize people. You also see it in the recent Dutch elections here, right? That the figure who, sort of won the elections was in a certain way the one who was most mediagenic in terms of, who also put a lot of effort in recent years in getting the media right, so to speak. And interestingly, coming back to your question, right, he also, their campaign copied the 2008 Obama campaign in many ways. So you see this kind of historical learning curve there as well. And I think overall, really, it's really a balancing act between really using the media as a sort of force of democratization, but also guarding against it being a force of de-democratization, right? This democratic backsliding wherein you have these larger than life publicity politicians directly speaking to the people and kind of bypassing democratic institutions like parliaments.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, there's an important message that a lot of these phenomena are not new. We've seen them before, but I think the more interesting and important point that your book makes is that this relationship between media and politics is part of politics itself, and it has been for over 100 years. And the period that you study really pinpoints a critical foundational time with this emergence of mass media and the expansion of technology and modernity and all these factors that can help explain why that is. So, Dr. Van Waarden, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Betto van Waarden, Assistant Professor of History at Maastricht University. Check the episode description for a link to the book we've been discussing. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll speak with Jacob Ward, a reporter who knows the mainstream media logics inside and out. It'll be fun to compare how what we've heard today applies to the present. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Betto, signing off from Melba. See you next time.